Okay. Dear colleagues, friends, very welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you here today. We are going to discuss very important issues today, issues of protection of minorities, tolerance, multicultural societies. And the moment when we are discussing these topics are very important and specific. We are discussing those issues when we have violence and wars all over the world. My academic topic is US-Russia relation, specifically war in Ukraine. And I served twice as ambassador of Serbia in Germany and United Kingdom. And I am fully aware how those issues are important for all of us. And I really do hope that the messages we are going to send to Europe will find the right audience. And I hope that we will find a way to overcome these very difficult moments in our lives. Thank you, and again, welcome to our institute, and I wish to all of us a fruitful conference. Thank you very much. Now I will ask Director Goran Bašić to take the floor. Director, please.
Hvala Ognjene i ja sam, mislim da je suvišno reći, ja sam zaista srećan što smo se svi okupili u Institutu društvenih nauka i što smo ove dane posvetili, kao što je Ognjen i rekao, zaista jednoj važnoj temi, čini mi se ne samo više za region, nego i za Evropu i globalno, a to je na koji način se odnosimo prema multikulturalnom okruženju. Svet je koliko god težio da bude monokulturalan, sve više multikulturalan i to je prosto činjenica koju ne možemo da prenebregnemo. Na početku ove konferencije želim da pozdravim gospodina Žigmanova, ministra za ljudska i manjinska prava i gospođu Brankicu Janković, poverenicu za zaštitu ravnopravnosti. Znači nam njihovo prisustvo jer ukazuje na značaj ovog problema, na njegovu društvenu težinu i hvala im što su podelili svoje vreme sa nama. Takođe, naš organizator je Savjetodavni komitet za Okvirnu konvenciju za zaštitu nacionalnih manjina i to nije slučajno. Ovaj događaj u suštini je posvećen Okvirnoj konvenciji, odnosno 25 godina je prošlo od kako je Okvirna konvencija stupila na snagu i to je jedan značajan period kada su neke države već prošle 4 ili 5, neke posljednje sa 6, čini mi se, ciklusom monitoringa i to je nešto što predstavlja jedno iskustvo, jednu snagu i za evropske politike i za nacionalne politike kada je u pitanju odnos prema multikulturalizmu. Među nama je predsjednica komiteta, takođe šefica divizije za nacionalne manjine i manjinske jezike, gospođa Liza Kornu i tu su takođe i raniji predsjednici komiteta, mnogi sadašnji i bivši članovi i čini mi se da je to dobra garancija jedne inspirativne diskusije o tome kako se Okvirna konvencija primenjuje, kakav je odnos, čini mi se da je to krucijalno pitanje danas, kakav je odnos između primjene standarda i ono šta ti standardi proizvode u životima u multikulturnim društvima. Ponekad ispunjavanje standarda ne mora da znači da je sa multikulturalizmom sve u redu. Želeo bih da takođe da se zahvalim kolegama i koleginicama članovima akademske mreže za saradnju u jugoistočnoj Evropi koji su ovde, koji su se potrudili, zaista više meseci su radili i pripremili su jednu zbornik koji se zove Monitoring Minority Rights i posvećen je upravo primjeni okvirne konvencije u postjugoslovenskom prostoru. Kad budete čitali, naša želja je u suštini bila da to bude neki handbook, neki orijentir kolegama iz savjetovnog komiteta kada dolaze u monitoring na ovaj prostor, da imaju neku informaciju više, da imaju neki podatak koji možda neće naći u državnim izveštajima ili koji možda neće biti vremena da ga prikupe tokom razgovora, tokom monitoring posete. I nadamo se da će to biti od koristi i vama, ali i naučnoj zajednici. Mi smo u maju mesecu smo imali jedan sastanak u Cilju na kome smo se našli, u kome smo napravili neku malu metodologiju koja je bila vrlo otvorena. Svaka država ima svoje specifičnosti u odnosu na upravljanje multietničnosti, u odnosu na uređenje i utoliko koliko se razlikuju te politike, razlikuju se i ovi radovi. Vidjet ćete da je tu jedan pristup koji daje puno mogućnosti za razmišljanje i za kreativni pristup u traženju rešenja za jedan bolji i skladniji multikulturalni prostor. I želim da se zahvalim takođe su izdavaču ove publikacije, Institutu za etičke ili Institutu za narodna strašanja iz Ljubljane. Sonja, hvala. Uvek znamo da imamo odličnog partnera u vama. Nazad, i time bi završio moje obraćanje na početku. Obećavam da ću vas posle ručka malo više pritisnuti sa mojim shvatanjima multikulturalizma. Za 2 dana je dan ljudskih prava. Svet u kome živimo nije više onakav kakav bismo mi želeli da bude ili onakav kako smo živeli pre deceniju ili malo više. Oko nas se zaista dešavaju grozne stvari na koje, čini mi se, nisam se ni sa kim ovde konsultovao, sam pripremio i ponudit ću vam jedan apel koji bismo mogli da uputimo međunarodnim organizacijama. Ja ću vam ga sada kratko pročitati i ako se dogovorimo da ga pošaljemo, onda ćemo ga poslati kao pojedinci. Ne kao članovi instituta, zaposleni ili kao Saveta Evrope ili bilo kako, nego kao pojedinci koji imaju pravo da budu kao građani Evrope, koji imaju pravo da budu zabrinuti za svet u kome živimo. I evo ja vas molim samo vrlo je kratko, za nekoliko minuta pažnje. Apel za okončanje sukoba i dostojanstven život povodom 10. decembra Dana ljudskih prava. Učesnici međunarodne naučne konferencije Challenges of Monitoring in the European Multicultural Environment duboko su učestvuju u patnjama ljudi širom sveta koji trpi nasilje i nevine su žrtve ratnih stradanja. Naročito izražavamo zabrinuto za pripadnike grupa koji zbog svog etničkog, nacionalnog i verskog porekla pate ili trpe nasilje, životno su ugroženi ili su izloženi ponižavanju, ekonomskoj, socijalnoj ili kulturnoj uskraćenosti. Pozivamo međunarodne organizacije i njihove članice da se bez kompromisa zalaže za momentalno postizanje mira svuda u svetu i da preduzmu sve raspoložive mere kako bi se otklonile posledice ratova, sprečile opasnosti od novih sukoba, podstakao ekonomski, socijalni i kulturni napredak i ohrabrio razumevanje među ljudima različitih etičkih, kulturnih i verskih zajednica. Uvereni da je život važniji od teritorija i raspodele moći,
te da su granice propustljive linije spajanja, a razgovor, poverenje i kompromis osnove za postizanje održivih rešenja. Zalažemo se za održiv mir i stvaranje atmosfere u kojima slobodni ljudi imaju mogućnost da tragaju za srećom. Ovo sad malo podsjeća na deklaraciju o nezavisnosti, to traganje za srećom, ali dobro zvuči. Dobit ćete ovaj tekst, ja mislim, vrlo skoro, ako već niste, na engleskom i na srpskom. Razmislite malo o njemu i pre ručka, ukoliko mislite da je to dobar tekst, ne morate mi ništa reći. Ako imate neku rezervu u vezi sa tim da ga usvojimo i da bude, onda vas molim da mi to kažete, pa ćemo odlučiti da verovatno ostane samo taj apel u ovoj sobi. Hvala vam puno i želim nam svima da se dobro osjećamo u ovoj prostoriji u Beogradu ovih dana i da imamo dobar razgovor.
Hvala, Gorane. Thank you, Goran. Before I ask next speaker, Elisa Corney, Division for National Minorities and Minority Languages, Council of Europe, I would like to ask all speakers to speak slowly as much as possible, because we have simultaneous translation, and people who are doing this job ask me to ask you to do it slowly as possible. Now, Elisa Corney, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Dear Goran, dear experts, dear participants, it is a great pleasure for me to be here today with you for this conference organized to mark the 25th anniversary of the entry into force of the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. I would like to warmly thank Goran Bazic for taking the initiative to organize this conference, and for bringing us all together today and tomorrow to reflect on the challenges of monitoring in the European multilateral environment. I'm pleased that the Council of Europe has been able to contribute to this event, although I must stress that the bulk of the work has been done by you, Goran, and your team, and I thank you for that. The entry into force of the Framework Convention 25 years ago was and remains a great source of pride for the Council of Europe. The Framework Convention and its sister convention, the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, remain today the only legally binding multilateral instruments for the protection and promotion of minority rights. The Framework Convention is a landmark achievement for the Council of Europe. In May 2023, the heads of state and government of the Council of Europe met in Reykjavik and adopted a declaration in which they underlined the important role played by the Council of Europe in protecting and promoting the rights of persons belonging to national minorities. This recognition was welcome at a time when minority protection is facing many of the challenges that you will be discussing today and tomorrow. It is also a recognition of the quality of the work carried out by the Advisory Committee over the past 25 years. Indeed, the recommendations and standards drawn up by the Advisory Committee through its opinions and thematic commentaries are references for the work of various bodies in the Council of Europe: the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, the Venice Commission for Democracy Through Law, the Parliamentary Assembly, to name a few. There are also references for cooperation activities of the Council of Europe in the field of anti-discrimination. These recommendations and standards are also used by other international organizations as benchmarks for assessing the state of minority rights protection, in particular in states that are candidates for accession to the European Union. 4 years ago, the Committee of Ministers adopted a set of measures to reform the monitoring mechanism of the Framework Convention. I would like to mention two of them: the automatic publication of opinions and the confidential dialogue. The automatic publication of a final opinion no later than 4 months after it is sent to the state concerned has reinforced the impact of the advisory committee's work by ensuring that its opinions are still fully relevant at the time they are published. The confidential dialogue is a new stage in the monitoring procedure, which allows monitored states to draw to the attention of the advisory committee possible factual mistakes and inaccuracies. The line between observations of a factual nature and observations on substance has not always been easy to draw, but the advisory committee has now established its practice in this respect. The introduction of this phase in the monitoring procedure has resulted in additional work for the experts and for the Secretariat, as well as an increase in the time needed to adopt an opinion. However, it has also improved the quality of the dialogue with the state parties, and we have seen a significant reduction in the time taken by the Committee of Ministers to adopt a resolution. The implementation of the reform started in January 2020, but was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused major delays in the monitoring work because country visits couldn't take place as planned. Today, we are on good tracks to catch up on these delays, but this requires a great deal of investment on the part of the experts and the Secretariat. However, I'm pleased to inform you that this year we concluded the 4th monitoring cycle with a visit to Montenegro one month ago, and we initiated the 6th monitoring cycle with Liechtenstein and Denmark. The aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine has been strongly condemned by the Council of Europe institutions and bodies, including by the Advisory Committee. The Russian Federation was expelled from the Council of Europe in March 2022. However, it remained a party to the Council of Europe treaties that are open to participation by non-member states of this organization. This includes the Framework Convention. In September 2022, the Committee of Ministers modified the monitoring rules of the Framework Convention to limit the modalities of participation of Russia in the work of the Advisory Committee. This included the decision that an expert elected in respect of Russia, although Russia was not named, but there was a reference to a state having violated the statute of the Council of Europe. So an expert elected in respect of such a state cannot sit on the Advisory Committee as an ordinary member, but only as an additional member when the opinion on Russia would be examined by the committee. I should say that our channels of communication with Russia have since been cut. In October, we were informed that the Russian Federation decided to denounce the Framework Convention, but this decision has not yet been notified to the Council of Europe. As this is the 25th anniversary of the Framework Convention, I do not want to conclude on a negative note. And I also promised my colleagues in Strasbourg to say something positive. So, as a lawyer, I will mention two examples of legislative measures adopted in line with the recommendations of the Advisory Committee. The first one is in Spain. Anti-Gypsyism has been added as a prohibited ground of discrimination in the criminal code. And in the Czech Republic, the law on the compensation of women victims of forced sterilization was adopted. This has been requested for 20 years, and finally the Czech Republic adopted this law, which concerned Roma women. I could also mention the recognition in June this year of the Vietnamese minority by Slovakia. These examples show that the Advisory Committee has an impact on the ground And that is certainly why research and conferences are devoted to its work, such as the one today. So on this, I wish you all a good conference and thank you for your attention.
Hvala, Elisa. Sada bih zamolio Brankicu Janković, poverenicu za zaštitu ravnopravnosti Republike Srbije. Brankice, izvolite.
Hvala gospodinu Pribičeviću. Dragi poštovani ministre, dragi kolega Bašiću, uvažene koleginice i kolege i učesnice ovog našeg današnjeg skupa. Zaista se radujem što imam priliku da danas razgovaram i čujem eminentne i posvećene stručnjake i stručnjakinje u ovoj oblasti, jer mislim da je zaista jako dobro što naš institut za društvene nauke posvećuje posebnu pažnju ovoj temi i hvala naravno gospodinu Bašiću i njegovom timu što zaista u posljednje vreme imamo tu jednu mnogo plodonosniju i jaču saradnju i državnih institucija i instituta i akademske zajednice uopšte. Ja mislim da izazovi sa kojima se svi suočavamo i ne samo izazovi nego oni koji su prerasli dosta ozbiljne probleme jer ih evidentno nisu odgovorni akteri shvatili dovoljno ozbiljno, se svakako jedino mogu prevazići jednom mnogo boljom koordinacijom i razumevanjem i slušanjem akademske zajednice koja u radu institucije koju vodim, nezavisne i samostalne institucije Poverenik za zaštitu ravnopravnosti, prilično znači, pre svega kada se radi o i prikupljenju podataka kao jednom od velikih izazova, ali i mnogim drugim inputima koje dobijamo kao rezultat rada akademske zajednice za koju smatram da nekako nikada nije bila dovoljno uključena u ono što valja da uradimo mi iz različitih perspektiva državnih organa. Ne znam da li će se ministar Žigmanov sa mnom saglasiti, ali verujem da svakako ima mnogo više prostora za ovu vrstu saradnje. Iako je gospodin Bačić rekao da ne moramo da se izjašnjavamo, ja ću baš zato što ne moramo da se izjasnim o tekstu apela i da ga u potpunosti podržim, upravo stoga što je tekst koncipiran tako da ne koristi otuđeni birokratski jezik kao jedan od velikih problema onoga što danas zovemo porast, a reći ću posle svega čega je porast u Evropi i ovde kod nas i u regionu i jer je ovo zaista jedan jezik koji najviše korelira sa jezikom ljudskih prava koji koristimo mi u institucijama i koji je uvek u značajnoj meri, nažalost, drugačiji od jezika koji koriste političari, ali sa jednom dozom, rekla bih, emocija koje su nam potrebne i od kojih svakako ne treba da bežimo, jer šta znači uopšte usvojeni standardi, propisi i strateški okvir ako iza toga ne postoji vera i volja da se posvećeno oni primenjuju u praksi, što postaje neki svojevrsni fenomen ovih prethodnih godina, da mi često ocenjujemo da u našim državama i društvima imamo dobar zakonodavni strateški okvir koji se ne primenjuje. Za Boga, onda on uopšte nije dobar, jer ako ga ne primenjujemo, znači da je nešto nedostajalo ili u samom procesu njegovog kreiranja i usvajanja ili ne postoji politička volja i spremnost da se on primeni. Jer opet citirat ću uvaženog kolegu Bašića, to što smo ispunili standarde nikako ne znači da je sve u redu sa pravima manjina u našim društvima. 2015. godine sam započela svoj prvi mandat kao poverenica za zaštitu ravnopravnosti Republike Srbije i od tada sam u prilici da, zahvaljujući toj privilegiji da radim ovu vrstu posla, često sam u prilici da budem na različitim međunarodnim platformama za razgovor o problemima porasta, islamofobije, ksenofobije, antisemitizma, govora mržnje i različitih oblika
bar neadekvatnog, ako ne i nedozvoljenog govora. I svih tih sada 8 godina ta tema je ista. Znači da postoji neka greška u našem pristupu. Sljedeće nedelje idem u Berlin da razočaram po ko zna koji put moje kolege iz ostalih evropskih institucija za zaštitu ravnopravnosti, jer su me pozvali da govorim o ispunjenosti standarda za nezavisnost i rad nezavisnih institucija za zaštitu ravnopravnosti ili kako mi kažemo kako se zovemo equality bodies, dakle na nivou evropske mreže institucija. A zašto da ih razočaram? Zato što sam ja pozvana kao institucija koja je ispunila standarde pre mnogih drugih, ne ja, nego institucija koju vodim, pre nekih institucija koje su članice Evropske unije. Ali ispunjenost, razlog zbog čega smo mi više ispunili standarde za nezavisnost je zahvaljujući činjenici da mi nismo država članica, već država kandidatkinja za članstvo u Evropskoj uniji, pa su stoga oči Evropske komisije mnogo više uprte u to da li mi ispunjavamo ili ne ispunjavamo, nego kod država koje su imale tu privilegiju i sreću da postanu mnogo ranije članica Evropske unije, kada Evropska unija nije bila sa ovoliko različitih vrsta kriza. Naravno, ne vidim ja nužno da Evropska unija to prošla i moglo bi se reći da je konglomerat različitih kriza. Ne mislim da je to sada nekakav kraj ili nešto loše, kriza može i ojačati, ali hoću da im kažem da to što smo mi ispunili standarde našim građanima ne znači puno. Zato što ću im istovremeno i predstaviti istraživanje. Htjela sam da nekoliko podataka, bila sam rekla kolegi Bašiću da ću verovatno imati za danas, ali ne, oni su tek sinoć sirovi podaci, najnoviji podaci o percepciji građana prema diskriminaciji. Međutim, oni su samo brojevi i ja se ne usuđujem da bilo šta tumačim ovog trenutka, imaću ih iduće nedelje, pa ćemo vidjeti šta je to, šta se desilo, ko je i dalje najčešće diskriminisan, kakva je socijalna distanca i prema kojim društvenim grupama, šta je to što građani očekuju od nas institucija. Ali sam sigurna da, prosto sam sigurna da ne može sada u odnosu na istraživanje koje smo radili neposredno pre početka COVID krize, da ti naravno rezultati ne mogu biti nužno tako sa drastičnim promjenama i tada smo po ko zna koji put shvatili da građani i od nas nezavisnih institucija koji smo stvoreni kao mehanizam zaštite ljudskih prava prosto očekuju mnogo više, a mi nemamo tu vrstu mehanizma u okviru naših nadležnosti, pa očekuju da kršimo zakon, očekuju da izađemo iz okvira naših nadležnosti i zaštitimo njihova ljudska prava. Jer ono što se svih ovih godina pokazuje u praksi institucije je da kada ne utvrdimo da se radi o slučaju diskriminacije, da se svakako radi ili o povredi nekog drugog prava, što je lakši slučaj, jer mi u tim slučajevima uputimo pritužbu nadležnom organu na dalje rešavanje, nego se radi o jednoj posebnoj nepravdi. O nepravdi koja nije nužno povreda prava. I ono što smo mi notirali da postoji veliki problem u našem društvu je upravo to što ljudi osjećaju nepravdu. Ljudima je potrebna pravda. I sada ću reći nešto što je zapravo, mislim da li je taj pojam, je tautologija, neselektivna pravda. Nekako u posljednje vreme ja moram da je istaknem, iako to zvuči možda besmisleno, jer pravda je pravda i ne može ni biti selektivna, ali mi ovde svedočimo da imamo slučajeve onoga što se zove selektivna pravda i da ona stigne samo do određenih pojedinaca ili društvenih krugova i da ne važi za sve društvene grupe. Kada se radi o samoj praksi institucije, ona pokazuje da svih ovih, zapravo svih, koliko je to sad, 12-13 godina rada institucije, dakle 13 godina od 2010. Dakle, uvek su prvih 5 osnova u pritužbama građana za zaštitu od diskriminacije navedeni sledećih 5 osnova koji od godine do godine menjaju zapravo samo to mesto, ali to su pol, invaliditet, starosno doba, nacionalna pripadnost ili etničko poreklo i onda se zapravo menja zdravstveni status, seksualna orijentacija ili se prosto uvek radi o nekoj vrsti višestruke diskriminacije gde je pol u kombinaciji sa starosnim dobom ili invaliditet u kombinaciji sa starosnim dobom ili slične varijacije višestruke diskriminacije. Kada se radi o pritužbama za diskriminaciju po osnovu nacionalne pripadnosti, 2/3, mislim prošle godine je bilo 88% pritužbi, stizalo je za pritužbe za diskriminaciju pripadnika romske nacionalne manjine. Znam da vam svakako nisam rekla ništa novo i da su Romi nacionalna manjina koja je najviše izložena diskriminaciji i dalje isključena iz mnogih društvenih tokova, uprkos napretku i možda najvećim naporima koji su posvećivani od strane vlade, ali i drugih društvenih aktera za unapređenje njihovog položaja. To naravno govori o tome da je startna pozicija bila izuzetno teška i da je izuzetno teško izaći iz začaranog kruga siromaštva. I pogledat ću samo u trenutku imam ovde i podatak, dakle, ostale manjinske grupe se obraćaju u znatno manjem broju. To su, dakle, to je podatak za prošlu godinu, za koje Romi i Romkinje 63,4%, izvinite, malo pre sam pogrešila, to jeste 2/3. Bošnjaci 8,5%, Hrvati 3,8% pritužbi, Albanci 3,3%, Vlasi 2,8%, Mađari 2,5% i te pritužbe su bile pretežno u vezi sa ostvarivanjem prava na obrazovanje na maternjem jeziku, kao i upotrebi jezika i pisma nacionalnih manjina i neka još druga ostvarivanja nekih drugih prava pred organima javne vlasti i većina ovih slučajeva diskriminacije završila se eliminisanjem akta diskriminacije i prihvatanjem naše preporuke u slučajevima gde smo utvrdili da postoji diskriminacija. Smatrali smo da naravno, da još samo jedan podatak i neću više o podacima, jer mislim da je mnogo važnije da razgovaramo još o nekim, zapravo jednom drugačijem, na jednom kvalitativnom nivou, ali evo prema oblasti života. Neko, maybe someone should switch off. Okay. Thank you. Što se tiče oblasti društvenog života, pritužbe se najčešće odnose na nejednako postupanje prema pripadnicima nacionalnih manjina u postupcima pred organima javne vlasti, 24,5%, u javnoj sferi uopšte 16%, u oblasti rada i zapošljavanja 15,3% i pri pružanju javnih usluga 9,9%. I obrazovanje 8,7% i javno informisanje i mediji 6,2%. Ono što jeste uočeno da kada se radi o diskriminaciji po osnovu nacionalne pripadnosti, vrlo su česti slučajevi ove diskriminacije mnogo češći nego za ostale osnovne diskriminacije poput pola, zdravstvenog stanja i slično u javnoj sferi, dakle u medijima, jer i da dolaze često od vrlo uticajnih društvenih aktera i da se često radi ili o govoru mržnje kao obliku diskriminacije ili o ponižavajućem i uvredljivom postupanju, jer nekako postoji ta jedna lakoća izgovaranja govora mržnje ili onog što nije govor mržnje, već da kažem jedan, kako se to što može nazvati lakši oblik, a to je uvredljivo i ponižavajuće postupanje, jer ono što možemo reći da je doprinela institucija koju vodim, ja nekako ne volim ono da je sve to zahvaljujući nama, već i naravno podršci i pomoći i razumevanju državnih organa, pa i članova vlade, ne svih, ali evo to je pored ministra, pa ako ćemo obavezno da kažemo, on je bio jedan od onih koji su pomagali, mada su pomagali i oni koji nisu prihvatali preporuke i koji se nisu ponašali adekvatno, jer smo imali priliku da ih u javnosti osudimo, njihov govor i ponašanje, pa da na taj način i ostvarimo edukativnu funkciju institucije koju vodimo i pokažemo šta je to što ne treba. Ali nekako postoji ta jedna vrlo velika lakoća. Thank you. I will speak slowly. Postoji ta jedna lakoća izgovaranja nedopuštenog govora i to posebno nekako političarima ide lako. Pa onda imamo sad ono što verujem da će se pokriti kao tema u daljem toku ovog našeg susreta, to je porast sada populizma, mada mi se to sad zahteva, vjerovatno, i definisanje tog pojma i prihvatanja toga ne kao prolaznog fenomena, nego kao nešto što zaista postaje trajni oblik i fenomen koji zahteva jedan drugačiji pristup i razumevanje kako bismo imali jednu drugačiju situaciju, a to je da dođemo do toga da one teme koje sam vam ja pomenula da su uvek teme pred institucijama za zaštitu ljudskih prava, da imamo uskoro na nivou Evrope jednu drugačiju temu, da nemamo uvek, ako nije neko tehničko pitanje, da nije uvek to pitanje kako se dalje boriti. Pa evo i danas razgovaramo. Šta sada da radimo u multikulturalnom okruženju, kao da je to zaboga nešto što je došlo odjednom, a ne nešto što je trebalo da postane sastavni deo našeg života, jer ja i ne znam kada je to bilo da se nije živelo u multikulturalnom okruženju i šta je to zapravo što danas nije u redu sa nama ljudskim bićima i šta se to dešava pa tako sa lakoćem. To je naravno sada moj lični doživljaj, ali bih naravno i radujem se da čujem neka drugačija mišljenja. Kako smo došli do te lakoće zauzimanja stavova o vrlo kompleksnim društvenim pitanjima, državnim problemima, unutrašnjim problemima raznih država. Verovatno će neko sigurno od mene bolje odgovoriti iz akademske zajednice ili sfere politike. Kako je moguće da se tek tako lako zauzmu strane, a onda iza toga se navija za tu stranu, pa čak ni žrtve, čak ni ljudski životi izgubljeni nemaju isti status, nego su manje ili više vredni u zavisnosti od strane koju smo zauzeli. Zato i smatram da je vrlo vredan ovaj tekst apela koji upravo poziva na zaista stop ratu i gubitku svih ljudskih života. I mislim da je krajnje vreme da nešto uradimo sa našom civilizacijom i to mislim sa njom nešto duboko nije u redu. I mislim da je to zaista do nas, ovde do nas svih ljudskih bića i do institucije pa i učesnika ove konferencije, pa hajde da razgovaramo šta možda treba istog trenutka, pa i danas da promenimo ako nešto nije u našem pristupu u redu. Eto, hvala vam puno na ovoj prilici.
Hvala poverenici za ravnopravnost, zaštitu ravnopravnosti. Sada bih zamolio ministra Žigmanova da uzme flor, ministra za ljudska i manjinska prava i socijalni društveni dijalog Vlade Republike Srbije. Ministre, izvolite.
Hvala gospodine Pribičeviću. Čast mi je i zadovoljstvo sve vas pozdraviti u ime Ministarstva za ljudska i manjinska prava i društveni dijalog, svoje lično ime. Čestitati Institutu društvenih nauka i kolegi Bašiću na istrajavanju kada je u pitanju držanje teme multikulturalnosti čitavog spektra, onda onih sadržaja koje se iza toga kriju, jer treba reći da to nije česta tema unutar prostora akademske zajednice, da tomu pridonosi odsustvo ovakvih sadržaja u obrazovnom sistemu. Reći ću samo da ni na jednom od 4 pravna fakulteta u Republici Srbiji, čiji je osnivač država, ne postoji ni jedan predmet koji je posvećen tematici manjinskih prava, a reći ću da je to ustavna kategorija, da se okrzne istine u kurikulumu drugih predmeta i ovaj sadržaj, ali bojim se da to nije dovoljno kada su u pitanju vizije geneze, sadržaja naslonjenosti, izazova, institucionalnog okvira koji trebaju obezbediti ostvarivanje manjinske prava i tako dalje, a sa druge strane ni pitanje interetničkih odnosa, njezine dinamike nije, nažalost, tema samostalnih predmeta na fakultetima društvenih nauka. Na prste jedne ruke se mogu izbrojati doktori nauka koji se bave ovim temama i onda posledično i u prostoru javnosti vi nemate često i kvalitetne narative koje bi pitanje položaja manjina, dinamike interetničkih odnosa, manjinskih prava kvalitetno i redovno elaborirali. Potreba je velika i kada je u pitanju, i kada su u pitanju manjinska prava i kada su u pitanju interetnički odnosi. Samo da napomenem da je recimo u javnosti, pa čak i stručnoj, prešućena činjenica da sve nacionalne zajednice osim dve imale su značajne demografske gubitke između dva popisna procesa, više od 20%. Niko nije referirao, čak nije ni prepoznato kao tema o kojoj bi se govorilo, a sada da aktualizujemo stvar. Sada smo u izbornom procesu, predizbornim aktivnostima, niko ozbiljan nije otvorio pitanje demokratske participacije nacionalnih manjina, što su izazovi, što su rješenja, ko učestvuje, kakvi su mogući ishodi i tako dalje. Sve te insuficijencije kada je u pitanju tematizovanje u prostoru javnosti ovih tema, svjesni smo mi u ministarstvu i pokušavamo činiti korake kada je u pitanju unapređenja toga. Mandat od godinu dana, koliko se načelo, naravno da nije bio dovoljan kada su u pitanju ovi izazovi, to su procesi koji bi trebali duže trajati, ali ono što smo učinili mislim da možemo s ponosom istaknuti kao pozitivne pomake kada je u pitanju razvoja multikulturalnih politika u Republici Srbiji jeste da smo nakon 10 godina povećali finansijska sredstva za funkcioniranje manjinskih samoupravnih tela za blizu 20%, da smo ubrzali i na partnerskim osnovama uspostavili, osnažili dijalog sa nacionalnim savjetima nacionalnih manjina i uvećali njihovu participativnost kada je u pitanju proces donošenja odluka. Vidljivost tema iz područja multietničnosti, multikulturalnosti smo također osnažili. Danas je 7. decembar, praznik je nacionalne zajednice Romuna u Republici Srbiji. Ministarstvo je čestitalo, iskazalo određenu vrstu, kako bih rekao, ne samo dobrih želja, nego i osnovnih činjenica o Rumunima u Srbiji, značajne zajednice o kojoj gotovo niko ne zna jer imamo insuficijenciju i sadržaj u obrazovnom sistemu i tako dalje. U svakom slučaju mi moramo svakim danom, u svakom, kako bih rekao, svakom gestom doznačavati da ta pluralnost nije samo statistika koja se potvrđuje svakih 10 godina na popisu, nego ona mora biti živa. To nas čini naravno unutar ministarstva i koraka koje činimo ne samo tako opredeljen zbog razloga što trebamo svi biti posvećeni pravdi. Etnokulturalni aspekti pravde jesu nezaobilazni u savremenim državama. Koncept multikulturalnosti je odgovor na to da se ona deunificira i u tom smislu mislimo da ćemo, ako sve bude u redu i rezultati izbora to budu tako poslužili, da ćemo insistirati da moramo nastaviti razvijati multikulturalne politike. To ne samo iz razloga, kako sam rekao, naloga pravednosti koje je osnovi države, nego i zbog socijalne kohezije, stabilnosti i ono što je zanimljivo kada je u pitanju ovaj prostor i razvoja međudržavnih odnosa. Vi znate da sam ja među ostalim politički prvak Hrvatske zajednice i da je moj izbor za ministra u vladi Republike Srbije bio novi povod za relaksiranje odnosa između Republike Hrvatske i Republike Srbije, gdje postoji drugačiji način političke participativnosti nacionalnih manjina i drugačije iskustvo kada je u pitanju učestvovanje predstavnika srpske zajednice i njihovih političkih organizacija u institucijama kojima se donose odluke. U tom smislu čestitam još jednom organizatorima što u povodu 25 godina od usvajanja okvirne konvencije organizuje ovaj skup na sa međunarodnim učestvovanjem kako bi se sve stranije sagledali izazovi koji danas postoje, da bi se mogla napraviti neka vrsta evaluacije onoga što je učinjeno i u Europi i u našoj državama u okruženju, ali isto tako da vidimo šta su izazovi kako bi se čitav taj spektar bolje, sve stranije i, kako bih rekao, dublje ukotvio, užljebio u onome što jeste društvena realnost Srbije danas. Multikulturalnost je koncept žive prakse, pre svega državnih vlasti, od lokalnog, pokrajinskog do republičkog nivoa, barem kada je u pitanju Republika Srbija, s obzirom na administrativni ustroj vlasti. U tom smislu želim vam svaki uspeh. Mi ćemo akademsku zajednicu sa njezinim krhkim resursima i dalje koristiti kao partnere kada je u pitanju kreiranje i razvijanje naših politika i nastojati da multikulturalnost u Srbiji se razvija i da bude živa, pluralna i bogata svakodnevna praksa. Zahvaljujem i izvinjam se jer imam drugi skup u 11 sati pa ću napustiti što nije lepo, ali neki puta se mora i to dogoditi, ovaj skup. Izvinite još jednom i svako dobro.
Hvala ministre. Direktor Bašić.
Tome je moj prijatelj iz Saborac preko 30 godina. Sad sam otkrio koliko smo stari. Ali moram da mu skrenem pažnju da nije naučna zajednica krhka, nego smo mi nežni prema vama.
Molim moderatora za novu Duška Janjića. Ajde, bit ću ja s vama, jer ja moram...
Ako ti nemaš rešenje, da idem. Evo, čečujte. Treba da počneš jer čovjek... A nije čekao u Dublinu da počnemo, ali 10:30 A ti treba da moderiraš.
Izvinjavam se, tek sad sam shvatio da ja treba da budem moderator, što i otuda ovolika ljubav, hvala vam. Pa evo da odmah počnemo jer kasnimo, šta da kažem, Dejan Jović. A imamo iz, ok, who is there? Ok, I have the program, that's my problem. Well, yeah, it's, who is the guy? Who is the guy? Okay, so sorry. Siniša, izvinjavam se. To što je jedan amater. Izvolite, imate reč.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. So, yeah, thanks very much to Dr. Basic for the invitation and to the Institute for organizing this important event. I'm very sorry that I'm not there in person. I was looking forward to that, but my flight was canceled yesterday, so I have to do it this way now, which is unfortunate. Let me just see if I can share my slides here with you. So it will be easy to follow. Okay, I hope you can see that. Okay, so essentially what I want to talk to you about today is perhaps the other side of the minority rights and multiculturalism, essentially where the threats come from. And we all know that nationalism and kind of more recent versions of populism and kind of nativism have been highlighted often as being kind of crucial threats to multicultural policies and essentially to any form of cultural difference. So what I want to do today is to look a little bit historically at the origins of this phenomenon and in order to try to understand the dynamics and the transformation of nationalism as a sociological and historical phenomenon. So we often, when we think about nationalism, the association is with the, kind of, this is something that is threatening to any kind of diversity, particularly more recently, anti-immigrant, anti-religious, religious minorities and linguistic minorities have been targeted. And kind of the framing has been around the notions like nativism, populism, and things like that. I think a lot of contemporary analysts have emphasized particularly this term new nationalism in order to understand, to explain what has been happening over the last decade, let's say particularly with Brexit and Trump elections and the rise of the far right throughout the world, from India and Brazil and now Argentina and the Netherlands, all over the world. So what is important really is to try to see, to historicize this phenomenon in order to see that it is much more complex. It's been around much longer than we want to think about it. And also that nationalism is much bigger phenomenon than the one associated with the far right. So this whole idea of new nationalism has been largely interpreted through either economic or cultural frames. So some scholars like Jack Snyder and Fotopoulos talk about new nationalism as being really product of the way how economy has shifted from the 1960s onwards, more in direction of being a kind of neoliberal and a kind of more radical kind of shift in states being less present, less visible in economic policies. So their focus is on the victims of globalization, essentially arguing that what we are seeing is a global polarization in terms of greater inequalities throughout the world, but also internally within societies. And we know that obviously there's a lot of data on that showing that there is a greater the shrinking of middle classes and expansion of kind of poverty and things like that. So their focus tends to be much more on economic reasons. Then we have kind of more culturalist interpretations. Engelhardt and Norris, Goodhart before, and Kaufman, they talk about cultural backlash. They argue this is not really an economic phenomenon. It's mostly a cultural phenomenon. It's what we are seeing is changes in the perception of immigration, perception of cultural difference. There is an ideological discrepancy, a shift between elites, which seem to be global, as Goodhart would say, globalist anywhere versus nationalist somewhere. So majority of people being kind of not as mobile, very much born and stay in the same place, while the elites move around and capital moves around and things like that. But basically, these explanations are useful. They do highlight some factors in trying to understand what has been happening lately, but they are insufficient in terms of looking long-term. What has been happening really with nationalism for the past 250 years. Even the term itself, new nationalism, is not particularly useful to us because it tends to stress and kind of overemphasizes these recent events. Doesn't really look at the long-term trajectories of nationalism, doesn't see nationalism as a sociological, as a historical phenomenon, but as something to do with political parties, with kind of narrowly defined social movements. And the term itself is very misleading. It's been used for the past 100 years. There's hundreds and hundreds of books and thousands of articles using this term, starting with Theodore Roosevelt's speeches from 1920. So it's been in use for the past 100 years, and that was published as a book later on, New Nationalism. Then we have the concept being used in the context of First World War, Second World War, in the context of collapse of communism. Like Ignativ's book, Blood and Belonging, has a subtitle, Journeys into New Nationalism, and so on. So new nationalism is being widely used for very different phenomena for the past 100 years. So it's not particularly valuable as a sociological tool. There's another problem with this concept, is that it tends to overemphasize novelty of this phenomenon. It might imply that there was no nationalism before, and suddenly we have this nationalism, and we have constant emphasis that this is new, this has never happened before, or that what is happening now is something that we haven't witnessed in this form before, which is also a problematic assumption. The key issue really for us, particularly within the scholarships of nationalism studies, to look at how nationalism changes in the last 200 years or so. So this is in many respects just a variation on a process that has been expanding, developing, growing constantly, and becoming much more institutionalized since obviously French and American revolutions and Latin American wars of independence. So what we need to understand, and in that sense, this is particularly important in the context of cultural difference, of multicultural policies, is that nationalism is not some sort of an anomaly that interrupts some sort of normal life, and then we are all shocked and surprised, but it's been a phenomenon that is at the bottom, at the basis of modern social order. So in that sense, nationalism is not only a modern phenomenon, but modernity is also nationalist in many respects. So I define nationalism as an ideology that rests on the popularly shared perceptions and practices. So it's not just the beliefs, it's also what we do, that posits the nation as a principal unit of human solidarity and political legitimacy. There are obviously other interpretations and other definitions, but this is the one that I use in my books. And here, essentially, there is more or less agreement, I think, across the nationalism studies that nationalist discourse tends to obviously overemphasize nation over other forms of allegiances, other forms of attachments. It's seen as something that supersedes other forms of group identity. And it's also associated with the notion, obviously, of popular sovereignty, independence, freedom, and things like that, that I will talk about a little bit more. So in that context, it's crucial for us to understand that nationalism is there as soon as you have a nation state as a project. And it is a dominant form of political legitimacy. So once you have a state that is legitimized in terms of people, rather than divine origins of kings or civilizing missions or religious origins, you have to understand that nationalism in one way or another underpins that very principle of legitimacy. And it's also a dominant form of collective subjectivity in the modern era. So in that sense, in order to understand the intensity, the power of nationalism, we have to look at the organizational form of the state in which we live and have been living now for 200 years. And that's the nation state as an ideal form. So this is very different to the states that existed before that, empires which have dominated much of the kind of historical landscape for thousands of years, at least 5,000 years, patrimonial kingdoms, city-states, and things like that. So all of these states were legitimized in a very different way. So for them, nationalism obviously couldn't mean anything. Nationalism is profoundly modern in that sense. So I talk about these things in my books, particularly in the last three, and the grounded nationalism is the one that I'll just want to kind of highlight a few points here before I move on to the question of multiculturalism and diversity. So essentially, to understand nationalism, we have to, first of all, see it as a historical phenomenon. So it's not something to do with some sort of psychological responses, some crazy far-right politics. It is a historical phenomenon. So it's a historically grounded phenomenon that starts off essentially from a small groups and then spreads and becomes institutionalized, eventually becomes a state dominant form of political legitimacy in the state. So nationalism historically develops, we can say, vertically across different social strata, essentially middle classes, intellectuals, then incorporates other groups, and it becomes a cross-strata phenomenon, mostly at the end of 19th century, depending which parts of the world, and the 20th century. But after Second World War, it becomes the only legitimate way of organizing a political order in the world, replacing empires, which until then were still very much in place. So horizontally, it spreads also throughout the globe. I look at this phenomenon through three processes, which I call organizational grounding, ideological grounding, micro-interactional grounding. So organizational grounding, here again, I'll very briefly look at this. I explain this much more extensively in my books. So this is something that, emphasizes that you need some sort of a organizational vehicle to spread nationalist ideas and practices. So initially it starts obviously with revolutionary societies, small groups, clandestine groups. Then, we have larger social movements and different civil society groups. And ultimately, it's really the state that is crucial vehicle. States have coercive power, military, police, judiciary, and many other mechanisms through which nationalist practices become embedded and dominant. Then nationalism is also an ideologically grounded phenomenon. This also requires historical legacy to see how it changes over the course of last 200 years. It is built around specific grand vistas, of visions, ideas of collective liberation, emancipation, and belonging, and it uses these concepts to justify. Rulers use it to justify their right to rule, and those who contest the rulers invoke same principles. And nationalism becomes very powerful as a tool of mobilization, as we can see in the world in which we live, which is deeply a nation-centric world, and you can use these concepts every time. And then finally, nationalism is not just a structural phenomenon, macro phenomenon, it is also a micro phenomenon in a sense that it's dependent on micro-international grounding, which means essentially the world of everyday life. There is enormous, obviously, scholarship of everyday nationalism. Kay and Fox and others, starts, many years ago with Billig, banal nationalism. And this is crucial in a sense. This is not just institutional grounding through habitual acts, but also in small communities, in family life, friends and things like that. So micro level emotional attachments are crucial. Nationalism penetrates this world. It taps into that world in order to be successful. Okay, so this is very brief, reflection on where I'm coming from. And now I want to focus a little bit more on that question for our conference, and that's the question of cultural diversity and kind of minority politics and multiculturalism, especially. So what we see here really essentially is that nationalism has, for much of the kind of pre-modern world, what was a minority project. We don't really have a strong nationalist ideologies until late 17th, early 18th century among intellectuals. And as a large-scale movements, it's really a mostly 18th, 19th century phenomenon that starts as a cultural nationalism, focusing on, creating dictionaries of specific languages, standardizing languages, institutionalizing, things like that, and eventually becomes a political project. And it took much longer for that to take place. So this is interesting because we can make a comparison here with what is happening with the multicultural projects. They developed much later, obviously mostly in reflection to nationalism, and they have a similar position in that sense. They start off as a minority a phenomenon, minority project rejected by the state. Sometimes states are very hostile to any kind of multicultural policies. But eventually many states have accepted them. We know obviously some states have that institutionalized in Canada, Bolivia, and a number of states all over the world. These policies changed, and obviously there is also a backlash on the part of the state and reducing some multicultural policies and things like that. But the key issue here is that multiculturalism can only exist as a meaningful coherent politics and policy in the environment of nationalism, where nationalism is quite dominant. So in that sense, nationalism requires diversity as an ideological enemy, because the state, the nationalizing state, is this machine of homogenization. And we know that obviously immediately after the French Revolution, after the American Revolution, we had attempts to homogenize the state. So France is the epitome of this kind of assimilationist state, which had a ministry, that was very clearly defined, talking about necessity and means to annihilate the patois, the minority languages, and universalize the French language. So the whole idea of nationalism as a liberal project, when it started, in the wake of French Revolution, was also an assimilationist project. It saw the minorities, it saw the minority languages, in particularly as a reactionary, as a threat to the Republican idea, to the notion of a French state, which is perceived to be universalist. So this continues. Obviously, all empires, all post-imperial contexts have that, in a sense, which is different to empires. Empires were not hostile so much to cultural difference. They accommodated in one way or another. Sometimes they could be very aggressive, particularly in the religious sphere, but they were mechanisms that they institutionalized to channel, to deal with cultural difference. Obviously, the most famous is the millet system of the Ottomans, which was very much based on religious differences, and it wasn't, it's not multicultural in any way, but it was the way how empires tried to deal with cultural difference without investing too much, because obviously they weren't particularly interested in homogenizing empires, nor were able to do that. For that, they didn't have organizational capacity. There was no organizational grounding or ideological grounding at that level. So only really in the wake of French-American revolutions and the Latin American wars of independence that we see nationalism becoming gradually a global phenomenon. And we see how, again, gradually and slowly nationalism takes over from imperial projects. Sometimes they coexist, as was the case for many years in Britain and France, Belgium, and things like that. But this is often achieved, nationalist success was achieved through coercion, coercive power, coercive organizational grounding, and through ideological conversion. So in a sense, trying to kind of institutionalize and nationalize ordinary people. So the famous Weber's, Eugene Weber's peasants into Frenchmen. we always, in a conventional historiography, we always have this kind of two examples of a so-called late unification of Germany and Italy as an examples of, of fully fledged nationalism, which is completely wrong, essentially because these were just the beginning of the processes. These were still very much imperial projects. We know that Bismarck was very much anti-nationalist, and most people in the south of Germany saw occupation, of Prussia rather than unification of Germany. And it took, another few decades to get even symbols of a German state and things like that. In Italy, we know that only 3% of population spoke what is today standard Italian when Italy was so-called, unification took place under Piedmont and the Kingdom of Sardinia. And even, when that the decision was made to unify Italy, the parliament speakers, they spoke in French rather than Italian. So these are all legacies and vestiges of imperial world. So nationalism comes much later, and it comes through systematic and assimilationist means, using military drafts, compulsory military drafts, to bring people from different countryside and homogenize them. It relies very much on what Gellner and Anderson and other scholars have emphasized, the importance of compulsory literacy. You cannot have nationalism without high levels of literacy in standardized languages. So you need to standardize vernaculars. You need also to have compulsory educational systems to inculcate these values to ordinary people, to children, for generations. Obviously, mass media, public sphere. Anderson emphasizes affordable publishing. People have access to this information. Also, welfare programs crucial for development of nationalism in Scandinavia, particularly, and things like that. And transport and communication networks that you can connect the entire societies. So that for that it took really centuries. So in that sense, in the world in which we live, a lot of people emphasize the importance of national identity, but there is no national identity without ideology of nationalism. And, so this is crucial. This is a structural phenomenon. It is a product of organizational, ideological, micro-interactional grounding in order to understand where we will come. And this has a lot to do with shifting from this imperial world based on status and kinship in direction of these cross-class solidarities, how members of nations see themselves. And this is an interesting, this is, as Gellner used, the famous paintings of Kokoschka and Modigliani. He argued that, we shifted from this world, which was very diverse. Kokoschka's paintings are very blurry, and this is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And even this map, which shows a lot of ethnic diversity, is not very good because obviously it doesn't capture cities, which are extremely diverse. So there's much more diversity than this map can show. So this is the world in 19th century, late 19th century, very diverse. And then, in the late 20th century and early 21st century, this is Hungary, 90% ethnically Hungarian. So we saw this essentially is a result of this intensive nationalist policies on the part of the state, on the part of civil society. So it is a product of organizational grounding, ideological grounding, and also micro-interactional grounding. So what's interesting in the context of multicultural policies is that, here we have to look at this experience of nationalism to apply it in part to multicultural projects in order for them to be successful. So both nationalism and multicultural projects require, organizational grounding, ideological grounding, micro-interactional grounding. So we have to deal with all of these things. So you need something which we could call multicultural grounding in order for them to be effective. So you need organizational and ideological pressure to force states to implement multicultural policies. And multiculturalism doesn't come because people think this is a nice thing to do. You have to fight for your rights. And that has been the experience in most states where multicultural policies were implemented. They were implemented because there was a pressure from civil society, from social movements, from different people who were well organized and capable to bring this change. Multicultural policies also depend on both on the states and non-state entities. So minority group associations are very important. They were already mentioned this morning. And you need organizational capacity within the state and outside the state to make these changes possible. Also, ideological power of multiculturalism is important. Again, using similar techniques, which is not easy, obviously, to what nationalism has been doing, for 2 centuries now. what is interesting here is that in both cases, both nationalism and multiculturalism, we do have some similarities in terms of ideology. They are both group-centric. They both invoke this notion of authenticity and culture and religious rights, and also some shared myths of common descent. So a lot of similarities here. And Gellner talked about how this can lead in direction of what he called tyranny of cousins. So dominance of small micro groups, which can kind of operate in a very coercive way, in the same way as some states can do as well. We do have some, obviously, scholars who argue that it's possible to have a multicultural nationalism. Tarek, my friend Madoud, has written extensively about this, advocating the whole idea that nationalism can be reorganized, reformed, reframed to make it more plural, to accommodate multiculturalism, and he uses this term multicultural nationalism. But there is obviously a problem here because they are competing ideologies. Nationalism is, by definition, an enemy of diversity, so it's not easy to do this. It does tend to operate with these hard groupist categories, which shift in direction of cultural homogeneity. Even when you have governments which are fairly liberal and open for cultural diversity, it's the institutions that they foster cultural homogeneity. This is the process that has been in place for 2 centuries. And we know, again, if you look at the various surveys all over the world, being proud in one's nation is extremely popular attitude. That is an attitude that has been growing constantly after the Second World War. You can look at the Eurobarometer surveys, you can look at the Gallup surveys, you can look at the worldwide surveys. Constantly, all over the world, there's more and more people identifying in national terms. So this is a problem to deal with. So the question is, how do you navigate that? And that can be navigated because both multiculturalism and nationalism tap into that world of micro solidarities, of family and friendship ties. This is where this is all linked with. And so we have to look at these ideological and organizational powers in order to understand how to deal with nationalism from the multicultural perspective. Okay, I'll stop here now, and we can maybe touch on some of these issues later on in the discussion.
Thank you, Sinisha, for really, if I could say, interesting and useful introduction, and for a really good beginning of our work. As you know, we will have some speakers, key speakers, and after that will be discussions. Also, I have to apologize to all of you because I jumped in and on a professional way. Basically, for me, it's so early to do anything, especially to mediate this kind of the important discussions. Also, I have to apologize to our dear interpreters because they were, I suppose that they were in the really hard situation to interpret. For that, I'm asking our colleagues to slow down. Basically, bi trebalo bi da pomognemo našim prevodiocima. Dakle, prvo reč ima profesor Fakulteta političkih znanosti iz Zagreba, Dejan Jović.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to Sinisha for such a great introduction. While preparing my own paper or short intervention within 15 minutes, I first had a look at his abstract, and somehow what I will say is also in order not to repeat some of the things that he did, but also maybe to offer some alternative concepts as being potentially useful to this one, to the concept of nationalism, for which I also share a view that it's complex. It's been historically evolving, and therefore it's also understood in very different ways in different contexts, and therefore I think to treat it only in negative terms is a kind of political intervention into academic debates, and it's not always useful because then it blurs the clarity or it actually denies the clarity of the concepts themselves. Still, I also have taken into account the title of the conference, which has the word of challenges and also of Europe and of the European order. And I wanted to say something about that. Starting from what Sinisho said, I think we need to bear in mind that also the idea and the practice of Europe has been evolving, especially I would say after the Second World War, which I think is the most relevant, taken the nature of the global order very much based on nation states and being post-imperial, especially after the Second World War. And that therefore the concept of what is Europe and what it should be now is not exactly the same as, let's say, in the 1950s and the 1960s, in the times of a bipolar Europe, in which the concept of European unification in the West was very much understood as being allied completely with the United States of America, therefore semi-independent and under a protection of the United States of America through these ideas of Euro-Atlanticism. After 1989, I think we see a much more self-confident European project, or the idea of the European order, which understood this revolutionary change of 1989 as an opportunity, basically, to achieve what today is in modern terms called strategic autonomy through a withdrawal of the Soviet Union from Eastern Europe, which then left Eastern Europe available for unification and with the Western, and then also with a desire for the United States of America also to reduce their influence in Europe and to leave Europe alone somehow, most famously through this sentence of Jacques Pos at the beginning of the Yugoslav conflict with Slovenian War, which was, this is the time for Europe, not for the United States of America in Europe. And I would say that's really, for our contemporary context, important, because the notion of the new European order involved the idea, it's being based actually on European reading, or the dominant European reading of its own history. And the history of Europe in the 20th century is all but bright. Europe is the dark continent, as Mark Mazauer says. And if you look the 20th century in Europe, it was a birthplace of extremism, of violence, of totalitarianisms, of anti-minority policies, of ethnic cleansing, and so on and so forth, everything that goes with this. And in as much as the European community of nations did not initially take into account that idea to basically balance out with regard to the nation states, the contemporary context of the European order involves the notion that the European Union is here to prevent, in fact, nation states and nations of Europe to restart a war, to start another global conflict. So the point of the European Union, in my view, in contemporary context, is exactly to limit sovereignty of nation states and to counter ethno-nationalism that challenges then the nation states in terms of their borders and their legitimacy, their democratic legitimacy, because the democratic legitimacy within the context of nation states is based on the idea of self-determination, which is also the notion of democracy. So let's not go deeper into the conceptual debate. I think so therefore the idea of the European Union is, in some ways, it's also being developed with regard to advancing and maybe taking and maybe copy pasting some of the positive achievements of empires. Therefore, we're constituting a bridge between the contemporary context and the imperial context, bridging over the nation states and everything that they themselves, through violent nationalism, had brought to Europe and to the world in 2 world wars, and in the war of the 1990s, and now in the war in Ukraine, as well as in the Caucasus, as well as in the Middle East, which are areas linked somehow to the European context. The European Union is not a new empire, but it has many elements of empires, such as, for example, the notion of multiculturalism, the notion of blurred borders between the states, the idea that actually there should be something above sovereignty of nation states that would keep them somehow within the framework, if not under control completely by an external power that's been constituted by the nation states themselves. Therefore, it is a benevolent empire. It is a shared empire, an empire without the imperial center as such. I think it's important to notice 2 further notions with regard to the concept of European order. One is that unlike the global order, for which realists still argue that it is anarchic, although we know it has never been anarchic, it's just not structural. It's just not structured firmly enough. The European order, unlike that, is meant to be more structured and thus more of an order than the global order. And I think unlike the idea of an anarchic nature of international arena, the dominant Europe, that is the Western Europe still, tries to structure it through the idea and practice of the European Union. So it is to counter the anarchic nature of international relations. And then secondly, unlike the global system, which at the moment is, I think, no longer unipolar, European Union is unipolar, and it wants to be under the unipolar hegemony of the European Union. But the European Union actually still sees no alternative to itself, not only no better alternative, but it remains rather skeptical about any alternative on the European soil, for example. So, for example, the practice of neutrality, the practice of not wanting to join the European Union, and especially the practice of trying to link and ally with others than the European Union, are all treated as signs of failure on the side of non-EU states to adapt and to transform themselves and to satisfy criteria, or of intention of non-Western so-called external actors to spoil the idea of European Union unity through malign influences. So we have seen all these concepts very much mushrooming in the last couple of years. External factors, by which they never mean US, for example. They always mean some Arab states or Turkey or Russia or China, but never, for example, the US itself. But I think the process of creating one Europe as big ideal that would counter the danger of nation states, the danger of uncontrolled nation states in Europe, and therefore might prevent another conflict, is not completed. And if it ever can be completed, which obviously depends on the vision of the final borders of Europe, about which there is no consent. There's no ideological consent. On one hand, we have those who believe the borders of Europe are borders of secularity and liberal Europe, and on the other, those who believe that the borders of Christianity, for example, and they don't match actually. And there are many so-called problematic areas, such as, for example, the Western Balkans, and primarily the Western Balkans for the reason of the war in former Yugoslavia, but also Ukraine and Belarus and Moldova for the reasons of Russian influence, but also some exceptions in Europe, in the Western Europe, such as the neutrality of Switzerland or Norway, which does not want to join the EU, and in particular, the United Kingdom after Brexit. I think this British anomaly is particularly important, as this is the sign of democratic, but direct and active rejection of the European concept, of the European Union as such. Yet we can't say that Britain is not multicultural. Britain is a four-nation quasi-federation / quasi-post-empire, something that is sui generis, something that is an experiment and a project, like Yugoslavia in a way was, like the European Union in itself was. It's not a typical nation state. And we have many debates and challenges over the notion, is there a British nation at all, really, after all? And secession there is allowed, it's not illegal. I mean, you have secessionists in power, for example, in Scotland and so on and so forth. So where this British exception is interesting also is that although they are not against multiculturalism, they are, and this Brexit was inspired by this animosity towards migration and migrants. Yeah. So I think this is a different type of an opposition and the challenge to the European concept. Let me just say very briefly and more in passing that I see two major external challenges to the European concept, as I've just now described. Now, one is wars. And I already mentioned the former Yugoslav wars, but also now Ukraine, Middle East, and the Caucasus as well. I mean, whenever we have a war, this challenges the idea of peace building, and therefore it's seen as a failure of the European concept to establish and secure peace in the long term on the European soil. The second thing is, I think, internal migrations, and therefore this balance, especially with regard to unequal development, and therefore a depopulation of Eastern Europe, which produces migration, which is within the European Union positive, and actually, there is nothing legal to stop people from moving. Actually, the European project encourages moving of the people, free crossing from one country to another. It actually treats everyone as equal, as citizens, as domestic citizens, irrespective of where from in the EU they come. But nevertheless, that introduces new foreigners, new migrants, which are not migrants, in fact. And the European Union, it seems, for example, Brexit has been to a large degree inspired by that. But I will now look in the next part of my time here, introduce two specific challenges to this vision of Europe, one and united, which has not been materialized. For which reason I would say, in particular in this relationship between Western Balkans and the European Union, I see some kind of negative emotions, a sense of angriness, a sense of frustration and disappointment, of blaming the other for the failure of the project. I think the European Union is angry at the Western Balkans for what happened there in 1990. And had we not had this war and this integration and a resurrection of extremism, including neo-fascist extremism, actually the practice of ethnic cleansing and genocide, for example, not only rhetorically, but in reality. I think had that not have happened, the European Union would have been one and united to a very large degree by now. And therefore, I think the European Union, if not directed and subconsciously, is kind of very, very cautious based on this kind of negative emotions towards the Western Balkans. But therefore, it keeps it out somehow, it punishes it somehow. And on the other hand, of course, the similar things are being developed by these extremist and nationalist forces, extra-nationalist forces in the Western Balkans towards the European Union. Because this idea of European unity is completely opposite and actually incompatible with the idea of finally achieving independence after I don't know how many thousands of years, which is the fantasy promoted by local ethno-nationalists and sovereigntists. These two challenges, and I'll say something briefly about to the European project, I call sovereigntism and ethno-nationalism. I think the vision of one united Europe, which is based on reading of history of Europe as the area where we had wars, totalitarianisms, instabilities, which are not just a matter of past, but as we can see, they do happen in contemporary context. As I explained earlier, is actually directly suspicious of the idea of sovereignty. And the consequence of that is that the European project somehow involves the notion that sovereignty of nation states is potentially dangerous for both their own citizens, for example, minorities or others, or for pluralism in political sphere, or for migrants and for citizens in general, and for other states in Europe potentially. This is then reflected in the notion of post-Westphalian order, which is no longer being based on sovereignty as absolute power, but only of sovereignty as the most powerful power, but not absolute. This is linked with the idea of internal division of powers domestically, but also with the idea of transferring of sovereign authorities or parts of sovereign authority to Europe, or in the sphere of defense to NATO. So sovereignty seems to be an enemy of Europe, and Europe an enemy of sovereignty. And sovereigntists in foreign policy then seek alternatives to Europe, for example, searching allies and sponsors outside of the European Union among its competitors, whether the United States or China or Russia, Arab states or Turkey. At the same time, let me say that this is a paradoxical conclusion that goes against political reality or realpolitik, because especially for small states who join the European Union, actually they, by joining the European Union, increase and enhance their real power, and therefore turning the nominal sovereignty into near real sovereignty. By joining the European Union, small states of Eastern Europe actually empower themselves. They become more self-confident and more powerful. But nevertheless, they become more of a subject than objects of politics. But nevertheless, if you read, for example, the narratives of sovereigntists in Eastern Europe, they would claim that by joining the European Union, they're actually losing independence. They are becoming, that the Brussels is now the new Moscow, and so on and so forth. And so I think we need to be careful. Academic discourse has many good reasons to counter this sovereigntist discourse. There are many evidence, and actually a general framework is based on false reading of reality, I think, to a very large degree. The second challenge is this ethno-nationalism. I think this is where I refer then accepting basically what Sinisha said about nationalism as such, and therefore not making the sign of equality among and between all forms of nationalism. I think ethno-nationalism is challenged to both of these previously mentioned concepts, the concept of one Europe and the concept of sovereigntism. In its nature, it is quite often actually almost by default revisionist, as it wants to challenge the existing borders between the states. It treats current borders as undesirable and illegitimate and as product of previous historical eras, for example, empires or socialist federations. Such as these two, and then it challenges the principle of uti possidetis, turning of the internal borders of multi-ethnic complex states into international borders automatically and de facto. It actually claims that the self-determination has never been applied properly, and thus that their nation states are unfinished, as they do not reflect the will of the nation, and neither they reflect the ideal type of a nation state. And the ideal type would be, in Gilnerian terms, of course, that the borders of the states match the border of the nation, whatever we mean by state and nation, and this is very much debatable, and we have very different notions of these two concepts. They point out that it is a paradox that secession is much easier to achieve than unification, unless you're German, of course. But both of these alternatives now, I think, hope and expect the European order somehow to collapse, knowing that this is the main condition for the impossible to become inevitable. Now, I will slow down. I know it's not easy to translate. So for the impossible to become inevitable. From historical perspectives of the last such a moment of fundamental change of the European order, which was in 1989, which also was inspired by sovereigntism. Let's make no mistake that revolutions of 1989 in Eastern Europe were all about liberal democracy. No, they were not. They were about sovereigntism too. They wanted to get rid of Soviet Union. They wanted to create their own sovereign nation states. And in Yugoslavia, they wanted to get rid of Yugoslavia, and in Czechoslovakia. So sovereigntism is actually, these were national revolutions, not only liberal or not even primarily liberal revolutions. And we shouldn't be therefore surprised in what's happening in Poland or in Slovakia or in Hungary and so on and so forth, where we actually see the liberal component rather weak and sovereignist component rather strong even now. We should not be surprised. So their hopes and other people's fears are related to policy of waiting and getting ready for the moment in which the old order that now looks unchangeable, that's a European order, would become unsustainable. This is their hope, not really waiting for a Godot, but rather for Kairos. And they think the art of politics in getting ready for that moment when he comes, to recognize him and to catch him, because otherwise they fear they might lose the opportunity and the next one might not come in a long while. But collapsing of international order in the context of wars around Europe is not, in 2023, is not as unthinkable as it, for example, would be in 2006 or 2007, right? So let's see, I suppose everyone is watching at the results of the war in Ukraine. That would, to a large degree, determine the future of the European order, and both of sovereignist side and ethno-nationalist on one side and the pro-European liberal on the other side. Thank you.
Hvala, Nebojša. Izvini, Dejane. Still I am confused early morning, especially for so many provocative ideas. I noted only two. It's too much for me for today. The one is who hates who? Europeans, Western Balkans, or Western Balkans, Europeans. But it's really true what you said, that I qualified the questions for the discussions, that the German unification was the impetus for so many things, and for Ukraine, today's European Union, including maybe the conflicts about the Ukraine. And the second is really important to have in mind all what Mr. Jovic, Professor Jovic said about ethno-nationalism. That's about that. Our next speaker is Jeste Aleksandra Đurić Milovanović, iz Centra za tako evropske studije, Institut za balkanske studije u Beograd. Molim Aleksandru da uzme reč. Hvala.
Hvala najljepše. Ja ću svoje izlaganje izložiti na engleskom. Trudit ću se da budem što je sporija moguće zbog prevoda. It is my honor and pleasure to take part in this important conference, which is hosted on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Council of Europe Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, but also on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As a sociologist, social anthropologist in the field of minority issues, I have been working in the past 15 years on various aspects of minority identities. Therefore, this topic is very much close to my research interests. And the conference topic and its relevance in the present day moment, as already stated by my colleagues, actually highlights the need to further discuss and reconsider of the challenges, many challenges that minority communities are facing, especially in the perspective that I would like to bring here today, ethno-religious minorities in multicultural societies nowadays. Building on what was already shared by my colleagues, and this was really an excellent introduction, I would like to bring the perspective of ethno-religious minorities in particular, because there are certain discrepancies when we speak about protection of minorities, especially national minorities. And my presentation will touch upon issues of religious diversity, which was already mentioned in Siniša's presentation, especially among ethnic minorities in Europe and the place of ethnic religious minorities in multicultural policies. Many religious minorities are also ethnic, racial, and or linguistic minorities, meaning that such groups can be described by stakeholders, governments, scholars, media, and others by invoking one of these categories. However, minority communities, from my experience and my research, are very often viewed through the lenses of one single type of minority identity, and this is usually the national or the ethnic one. This view often poses a challenge to a more inclusive policies of multiculturalism. One important reason for this is the insufficient consideration of multiple forms of minority identities. And very often in this complex relationship between national or ethnic and religious identities in public discourse, which leads to perceptions very often of minority groups as monoconfessional ones, with already predefined religious identities. And very often in public discourse, we already know that this kind of prescribed identities sound like Romanians are Orthodox, Hungarians are Catholics, Slovaks are Lutherans, Roma are usually Muslims. And this is mostly the case in many Southeastern European countries where such overlap between religious and national identity is very much present. And in the course of the 20th century, however, religious diversity has increased in various forms through Europe, leading to more heterogeneous religious identities within different ethnic groups. However, the situation at the grassroots level is very different. We have to recognize that ethnic minorities have heterogeneous religious identities. Religious and ethnic minorities, or the syntagma that I was using in my own work, double minorities, are examples of more complex forms of minority identities that are often overlooked in multicultural policies. And the question is, why is this the case? First, where do we position religious minorities in existing legal frameworks? Religious minorities are formally covered in human rights protection offered by minority rights, and they are largely excluded from mechanisms and procedures when we speak about the protection of national minorities, of course. And in her paper, Are Religious Minorities Really Minorities?, Nazila Ganea argues that roots of minority rights are to be found in the protection of religious minorities. Religious minorities are formally covered in human rights protection offered under both freedom of religion and belief and minority rights, these being in addition to existing rights. Religious minorities have always been assumed to be part of minority rights normatively, but in fact rarely being protected through it. Very often when religious minorities face discrimination or persecution, their case is considered under the umbrella of freedom of religion and belief and not under the umbrella of minority rights. Secondly, perception of religious minorities in public discourse will largely depend on a legal framework, on first, one which is the law on churches and religious communities, which defines who is in the category of recognized or communities that have a status of so-called traditional churches and religious communities, and who is not, and who is in the second category of the legal framework, usually now in Serbian context, divided into confessional communities. It is very often the case that when in the public discourse on multiculturalism, it is referred to existence of several religious communities. It is primarily referred to existence of so-called traditional religious communities, while numerous minority religious groups are left outside the religious diversity box. Public discourse plays an important role there strategically because it makes a distinction very often between those religious communities that are perceived as new religions and those that are perceived as ethnic religions. Thus, traditional religious communities are accepted to be part of cultural identity, diversity, while the existence of the smaller minority new religious groups is most frequently ignored. Subjective feeling of social exclusion is most frequently present in a number of minority religious communities due to the fact that very often in the public discourse they are negatively characterized with the pejorative terms or language such as sects. While the use of pejorative language to indicate religious minorities reduces such groups' legitimacy as a religion and increases their marginal status, religious minorities sometimes internalize and use also negative terms to diminish themselves from other groups perceived as different or potential threat to society. Being recognized legally or otherwise as a legitimate religion is more often than not crucial for survival of religious organizations, and thus this sometimes implies attempts at delegitimizing other groups. In the societies where some ethnic groups are primarily defined as ethno-confessional communities, religion becomes one of the main also ethnic identity markers and play an important role in drawing national boundaries. The majority groups, but also the minority elites, frequently insist on defining what they see as being a true and desirable identity, stressing the importance that the preservation of traditional identities and traditional cultural models has to the community. I would also like to underline that members of religious minority groups often try to protect their religious identity through isolation from a broader environment. This self-isolation aspect doesn't often reflect the current legal and constitutional framework of one country, whereby nominally all religious communities are treated equally and have rights to express their religious identities and beliefs. One of the biggest challenges, despite the variation among countries, we see as a common thread. Only a minority of people in European countries, based on the survey that was done by Religious Monitor in 2023, view religious diversity as distinctive, positive, and enriching. This prevailing critical perspective on diversity also carries implications for social interactions. In this respect, it is also key to mention that the position of ethno-religious minorities does not only depend on different minority legal frameworks, but largely depend on the issue of freedom of religion and belief as well. And according to Tarek Mudud, who was already mentioned by Professor Malešević and Thomas Seeley, from the second half of the 20th century, relation between freedom of religion and accommodation of religious diversity has appeared at the forefront of political and scholarly debates in Europe, which has also been a result of the post-Second World War migratory flows, but also the emergence of new religious movements. In different parts of Europe, this religious diversity has been accommodated in different ways, but it has been one of the major challenges of multiculturalism, in addition to the fact that multiculturalism represents one of the key discourses in understanding diversity of contemporary societies, but it also strongly questions the position and rights of minorities in relation to majority. Just as there are no ethnically homogeneous states, there are very rare states which are not having presence of different religious traditions. And therefore, the relationship between multiculturalism and increasingly present religious pluralism requires special attention. And during the 20th and the 21st centuries, it contributed to the growing visibility, growing and visible multi-confessionalism, and to the emergence of new religious movements, not only their presence in the West, but also in the post-communist countries of Southeastern Europe. Which means that appearance of religious communities that found their place in areas where they were completely unknown, and the key influence in that process also is linked to the displacement, migration, and other global changes and challenges. The key influence on the freedom of religion and belief have also, as mentioned, had migratory flows, which had an impact on creating more heterogeneous and diverse religious landscape of the European societies. This more and more heterogeneous religious structures leads to rethink and question the existing normative frameworks in many nation states, as well as the boundaries between public and private sphere, whereby the right to religious freedom could be in a collision with normative framework of the freedom of religion. More complex religious landscape and emergence of new religious identities, which did not exist in particular regions, had a significant impact on societal response when it comes to the question of inclusion, tolerance, and anti-discrimination. Therefore, challenges of post-immigration and increased ethno-religious diversity nowadays is especially evident in the last years when we speak about the influx of refugees and migrants coming from the Middle East. And in that regard, Erin Wilson argues that since the majority of refugees are from countries where Islam is one of the dominant religions, they must be Muslims. However, the reality is that many refugees are also Christian, atheist, Baha'i, Yazidi, as well as Muslims. Not only that all refugees are assumed to be predominantly Muslims, but they are Muslim in the same way. This ignores the numerous variations in beliefs and rituals and practices across understanding of what does it mean to be Muslim. Even though on declarative or primarily level, whereby equal rights for religious communities are often guaranteed, on secondary level or in practice, there are numerous obstacles which indicate that inequality and discrimination of minority religious communities exist. How can we go, and one of the key questions is how can we go beyond declarative discourse of non-discrimination and raise awareness on many particularities of different layers of identities, especially within minority communities, and how can multicultural policies be more inclusive when it comes to ethno-religious minorities? One of the key aspect that very often is not taken into consideration is how can we overcome indirect discrimination, religious discrimination. Sometimes we say that direct discrimination towards religious groups and communities maybe is not in the past decades so visible. Before that, we had attacks on, for example, pastors of some evangelical minority groups that were monitored, or attack on the religious buildings. So that would be very much on the level of direct discrimination. But how can we go? But there are many nuances when it comes to indirect discrimination, something that is not visible from the first glance, but still exists, and it is present in many European societies. One of the elements is this discrimination as a consequence of the laws or legal instruments, which are very often created from the perspective of majority religious communities. Indirect discrimination can be very much linked to the presence of philitism or ethnophilitism, something that is very much common in the context of the Balkan countries. Something that is that limits the sense of freedom of religion in the way that favors particular ethnic national identity of a religious group and creates more divisions and more discriminations on those who do not share the same ethno-religious background. Still, this represents a challenge in many societies where ethnophilitism is present and creates a strong bond between ethnic, national, and religious identity, which is overlapping. There are many other examples from religious time, right on religious holidays. For example, non-working Saturday for some communities is something that is primarily important for their religious identity, and not having the right to do so is jeopardizing, and it does represent an indirect discrimination. Then the question of religious education and many other elements. The list of existing challenges and possible directions of rethinking ways of ethno-religious minority protection in Europe today is much longer. I have tried to address one level of collective ethno-religious identities which perceives ethnic national minorities as monoconfessional groups and put emphasis on their collective identities. And second level is the perception of the freedom of religion and belief through the prism of individual rights, which is an essential basis of any future action towards raising awareness of the many layers of indirect and hidden discrimination patterns. Discrimination cuts across both modalities of minority identities in practice, and the key word in the process of understanding these challenges is sensibilization of societies on the awareness level on the complex nature of ethno-religious identities, which is not a definite or concluded process, but ongoing one. It seems that some religious minorities are on a normative level free to practice their religion. However, on a societal level and on the individual level, on the level of individual interaction, we are very often facing xenophobia and exclusion, even from the members of their own minority groups. This leads to the increased risk of invisibility and segregation. And this is one of the most frequent challenges, which also leads to one-sidedly understood multiculturalism, which is declaratively inclined to very often national ethnic minorities, which essentializes the usual form of minority identity and represents the obstacle in recognition of a different dimension of pluralistic societies in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, for underlying and really rightly pointed issues or position of religions in the multiculturalism, especially the religious rights and minority religions, hoping that it will be the part of our next coming discussions. And the next key speaker is Professor Petai from European Center for Minority Issues. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's indeed a great pleasure to contribute to this event today, not only through food and drink last night on behalf of the European Center for Minority Issues, but hopefully with some intellectual food for thought here this morning. Moreover, I'm particularly pleased by the composition of this panel, which I really wasn't expecting, and in particular, in terms of the mutual reinforcing and enriching and thematic foci that we've had so far, starting with Sinisha's historical perspective. Dan, we're talking more in light of international relations. Alexandra, now most recently, focusing on ethno-religious minorities. And I approached this panel looking at the three words that were put into the title: nationalism, populism, and ethnicity. And I think that as scholars and practitioners working on minority issues, we're generally familiar with ethnicity. I think it's a thing we can recognize when when we meet it up on the street or something like that. And by extension, it's relatively easy to recognize, especially after Sinisha's presentation, what I would say is the politicized variant of ethnicity, namely nationalism. So here, nationalism, as was stressed, is very much an ideology or a kind of political agenda to capture or identify the use of the modern state to reinforce or prioritize the status or opportunities for one particular ethnic group within a territory. So the ethos of nationalism is really to put the means of the modern state through control of all kinds of different policies, be it education or language or immigration, really in the service of strengthening the ethnic homogeneity of a country. And this, by extension, of course, disadvantages those who are not in the chosen group. And so, at its simplest, as we've discussed already, nationalism is about reinforcing these tenets of a nation state and really privileging the construction of a state which is really formed around one central ethnic group and its cultural communicative system. So with that now set aside, what I want to focus on is the last word in that triad, populism, which we haven't, I think, focused on yet in greater depth. And I'll offer some reflections on populism through a couple of EU Horizon 2020 projects that I worked on in the last 4 or 5 years. As usual with the EU projects, they always have a nice acronym. So you can look up either fatigue or pop rebel. And these were the ways in which, it was possible for me, at least, to reflect on both nationalism, but also now populism together. And the first thing to say really is that populism is often, sort of brandished about very indiscriminately. It is used by both scholars and politicians often as an insult. You're just a populist. Especially when we want to denounce some kind of unrealistic promise that someone makes, or someone makes an outrageous claim that is meant to radically simplify reality. then of course we brand that person a populist. And it's as is often the case in social science, it's very difficult to decouple words like populism from their more journalistic or bombastic use that we see in society. But I think it's important still to work on this decoupling if we're really to understand what's going on in European societies. Now, one of the most important dimensions of populism is that it is a kind of political worldview or rhetoric that seeks to demonize some group of elites, right, and to glorify government directly by the people. So hence, of course, the word populism. And these are two sides of the coin, right? We see evil elites that are somehow conniving against the true will of the hallowed people. And note that my point here is that this is much more than simple rhetoric. This is much more than simple bombastic speech. It's often a model of politics and of government that has very tangible consequences. It seeks to increase the use of things like referenda, right? Because the people must speak, so we need a political means to allow that voice to be heard directly. It also leads to a kind of mass quality of politics, that everyone then is all together in some large populace deciding things in the name of that group. And so this kind of trend speaks to ultimately a deep kind of majoritarianism. So again, a very social sciencey word, but majoritarianism that that stresses that the majority will becomes the overriding principle in governing. And this, of course, for us here is antithetical to minority accommodation or respect for diversity, because obviously divergence only complicates majoritarianism, and so majoritarianism must actually prevail over minority difference. So you see where I'm going with this. Populism, through its majoritarian impulse, is a danger also for cultural diversity. The true people need not only be united in some way, they also have to be as uniform as possible. And national minorities can be problematic or even be cast as some alien element to that goal or process of being able to actually realize the people's true will. So I think you see already the links between populism and nationalism. The political struggle, to use the means of the modern state to reinforce, the ethnic status of one particular group, is very much in line with the majoritarianism of populism. Populism is a kind of, or the majoritarianism is embedded in both ideas, and this is where we see very much the overlap. Now, another way in which scholars speak about populism is not in reference to nationalism, but in reference to nativism, which is a word that was already used earlier, and especially in relation to the discussion of right-wing populism. So that nativism is a kind of bridge concept between the populism and nationalism. It's a kind of rhetorical and ideological form for populists to really push their ethno-majoritarian agenda. And ultimately, all of this together speaks to another component of populism for many scholars, which is authoritarianism, right? So once you have a very strong push for majority rule and a search for enemies and a kind of imperative to promote a particular nation, it all leads to heavy-handed politics, which can often result in authoritarianism. So what happens in what one sees in the scholarship is, in fact, scholars have not even talked about well, populism or nationalism separately, but they combined it into one phrase, which is ethnopopulism. Now, I apologize for all of the social scientists who constantly attempt to come up with new terms and new words and sound really novel. But in one particular article from 2018, a professor from the Central European University, Aaron Jenny, spoke about ethnopopulists at length and argued that on the one hand, we saw too that nationalist views or ethno-supremacist views, things where we really think my nation is better than everyone else, may not be that much on the rise in a popular sense amongst surveys and people. So there's no real ethno-chauvinism perhaps going up, but there is a strong nativist impulse that is going on in contemporary politics, and it's linked also to this populist worldview of the people being able to speak and govern directly. And the nativism is part of also what a Dutch-American political scientist, Cas Mudde, has talked about in relation to populism, that national minorities or others are part of one of the enemies that populists always search for in order to find the reason why the true will of the people is not coming to the fore. And I don't want to dwell on this too long, but it is interesting that Mudde talks about minorities as the enemy that is inside the state, but outside the nation. And I think that's an interesting categorization. He has other categories, of course, where the enemies of populists are seen as, let's say, outside the state and outside the nation. These are the internationalist, globalist elites that are there. You have, of course, enemies who are outside the state but inside the nation, and these are, interestingly enough, examples like Mikhail Khodorkovsky for Russia, because he's outside the state, he's physically outside, but he's inside the Russian nation, and he's also seen as an enemy. So national minorities in this sense are again inside the state but outside the nation because they're not viewed as part of the majority, and therefore could also become one of the enemies of populists. And that's where I think this idea of ethnopopulism really makes a lot of sense. It speaks to the way in which certain forms of populism particularly stress the ethnic enemy and not just the globalist or other forms of enemies. And this is something that is particularly a challenge, therefore, for what we are working or concerned with, namely the protection of national minorities. And I think in this context of our celebrating the 20th anniversary of the entry into force of the Framework Convention, how much are ethnopopulists then, in this sense, targeting national minorities in the very strict sense of the term? How serious is this threat from ethnopopulists in relation to what we are focused on here today, namely the protection of national minorities? And arguably, it is not that extensive, since most ethnopopulists actually target other forms of ethnic minorities, namely immigrant minorities, refugees, migrants, etc. We don't have many right-wing ethnopopulists campaigning against national minority groups. Just to bring examples, I mean, there are Finnish populists, but they're not necessarily assailing Finnish Swedes. Italian populists are not deriding German speakers in Südtirol necessarily. The target of these nativist populists tends to be other ethnic groups, including Roma, of course. So this leaves us with two questions, and I'll sort of conclude there. One question is sort of in the negative direction, and the other is more in a forward-looking direction. The negative question is, could this ethnopopulism end up actually turning against national minorities at some point, alongside the kinds of targeting that they already do against immigrant communities, refugees, and migrants. Again, this depends on the country, but as ethno-populists come to power more durably over time, we see this, gaining strength in different forms. It could end up also slowly shifting the goalposts such that national minorities also become a target of ethno-populists more than they are today. So that's a little bit the cloud on the horizon. The more forward-looking question is what kind of future progress could be made on reinforcing and expanding the existing minority rights regime? Could we counter some of these challenges by actually improving the system itself and making it more viable? This should be indeed one of the main issues for a conference like this. What can be carried forward and improved after 25 years of the FCNM and other multilateral instruments? My fear is that the prevalence of ethnopopulism implies that even if there are good ideas to be found, additional networks or additional dialogue frameworks with states and others, that substantial progress will be difficult to achieve. There is a lot of valiant work, of course, that's being done to keep the existing system going and well oiled. But it's also being, of course, eroded very much by existing geopolitics and other disruptions. So I'm somewhat echoing, I think, some of the hints of pessimism that I saw in Dejan's presentation, but I'm happy to stand to be corrected by any comments or other reflections from people also at this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Professor. And now I'm calling all of us to join with questions, answers, opinions. First of all, to our key speakers, but don't forget two ladies, Elise Brankica. You could use opportunity if you like to ask something them. Minister likely escaped. Anyway, that means the floor is open. Who wants to start first? Please. And please introduce yourself, not to make any risk with my introduction of you.
Oh, that's that. This was such a great start of the conference, so I apologize in advance if my remarks will be too long, because all speakers were so inspiring, and I just have to say a few words. First of all, Professor Malešević, I'm so sorry you are not here with us. I was really looking forward to meet you finally in person. We use your book, Sociology of Ethnicity, at Faculty of Political Science in Podgorica. And sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, Daniela Vuković-Alasan, Associate Professor at the Faculty of Political Science in Podgorica, University of Montenegro. So we use your book, and students are very, very satisfied, I have to say. And thank you that you talked about complexity and ambivalence of nationalism. And we know that it can produce democratic or authoritarian potentials in specific contexts. And of course, you mentioned also the impact of globalization processes. And we know that globalization, it is in its essence, especially if we talk about the end of 20th century, it is actually a time period of very huge and very fast social changes. These changes, if we talk about technological ones, it has also impact, I would say, on different levels on which we can discuss the issue of nationalism. because it seems to me that in terms to make it more simple in theoretical sense of meaning, we should maybe make a difference between three levels of nationalism, national identity, impact, and identification with nation. That is, first of all, level of personal identity. Can we say that globalization somehow, because it's very paradoxical in its impact, somehow feed the need to maybe try to find this kind of traditional identities like ethnic, national, religious ones? So can we say that that's why it is maybe one of the reasons why national identity is important for people now in the globalization time period? Also, we can talk about the level of micronations or so-called proto-nations or minority nationalism. Can we say the globalization processes make environment for minority nationalism more positive in terms of that we have more space for exposing and more space of expression of nationalism at the minority level? And also what is happening at the level of institutionalized national identity when we talk about state level? Also, it is important how globalization have impact on state in terms of autonomy and area of competencies. But my question was to you, do you think that difference between civic and ethnic nationalism is theoretically and analytically useful, especially if we talk about this ideal model of ethnic and national and civic nationalism? I'm asking you because you know that Montenegro is defined as civic country. Can we use the designation civic nationalism or civic national identity if we know that civic identity is it post-national or non-national, or we can talk about civic national identity and what that would mean at the level of state identity, at the level of definition of political community. Also, what was very interesting to me, what you mentioned, is this combination of multiculturalism and nationalism. I was having in mind, again, context of Montenegro, which is a combination of civic political identity and multiculturalism model. So I think that at some point, if we are very successful in implementation of multiculturalism measures and mechanisms, and that means that we produce, let's say, we are avoiding feeling of injustice within ethnocultural communities, then we are successful in terms of making ethnic distance less than it is present in our society. So can we say that multiculturalism can help in the process of civic identity building, let's say civic society or civic political identity? So also, thank you, Professor Jovic, that you talk about ethno-nationalism. I think it's very important. It's very powerful ideology. We don't speak about enough, especially if we talk about Balkan region. And Professor Jovic is always one of a few professors and researchers that talk about it, which is very important, I think. And my question was, what do you think? What is the best way to fight against everyday ethno-nationalism? Because ethno-nationalism is an ideology in terms of its main elements like dichotomization, rigidity, anti-individualism, and in some points, simplification of reality, social and political. It can be promoted from different levels, from the state level, but also from the level of different actors, like political, social actors. What is the best way somehow to fight against it? Is it educational system again, media? What tool we should, let's say, use on everyday basis? Also, for me, was very interesting what you said, Alexandra, about ethno-religious minorities. We know that ethnification of religion is not something that is something that is very often, right? Many ethnic communities and ethnocultural communities base their ethnic identities on religious elements. So I wanted to check if I understood well that you suggest that state should provide some kind of extra legal protection
for ethnocultural communities, which identity is dominantly based on ethnification of religion, and especially if we talk about so-called double minorities, right, that are both religious and ethnic. And do you think it should be done through the anti-discrimination law and some extra measures in that sense? So maybe what kind of legal solutions you suggest, or you maybe think about it into legal level? Because now we have laws that are separated in terms that we have one law for religious communities that regulates their position, autonomy, relations towards state. And also the other set of laws we have for ethnocultural communities, national minorities, and civil. So it will maybe help to talk about also about three levels when you talk about religious identity. Personal level, we can have different interpretation of the identity of our religious community, right? Also level of religious communities, but also level of the state in terms of, I suppose, secularization as in something that is very important for our societies. And also, the last thing, it was very interesting, Belo, when you said this designation at the end, inside of state, outside of nation. So I was just thinking about the case when we can say that one community is outside of nation. Is it when we don't have membership in terms of state, like citizenship, or is it the case where we can't identify ourselves with political community? So when we are out and when we are in, this was just my, thinking about it. So thank you very much for your excellent presentations.
Thank you, Daniela. My proposal is to start immediately with some answers, questions, and after that to go ahead. If I could ask Alexander to start the first, because you were asking directly about two things.
Thank you, Daniela, for your questions and remarks. I have been working quite a lot with Romanian evangelical community in Vojvodina, and this concept of double minority really applied in the specific context where I have been researching specific national ethnic minority members who converted to communities that emphasize supranational identity of their members, that are more ethnically inclusive and diverse than expectations towards traditional Orthodox communities. And the whole research was based on the relationship when double minorities belong to communities that put more emphasis on religious identity than to the ethnic or national one. How does it work in the sense of belonging? Do Romanians who convert to, Baptist church or Baptist community have the same feeling of belonging to their own national ethnic minority? Or with their new identity, which is predominantly based on the new religious affiliation, diminishing the sense of belonging to the national community they are coming from, and then how their own national minority is perceiving them, usually as those who are traitors, who left, who are not any longer real Romanians, precisely because of this link between religion and ethnicity or nationality. And of course, this doesn't mean that all members of any minority group or citizens are religious or have religious beliefs or identities. We have a number, of course, of those who declare themselves on the opposite side. But in anthropological sense, even small groups that are numerically maybe insignificant from a legal perspective do actually showcase the existence of, at the local level, religious diversity and a new set of dynamics of relationship within different ethnic groups. So precisely just having in mind the existence of heterogeneous identities within those communities that are usually perceived as monoconfessional ones is already one step towards this kind of sensibilization. I don't know if the word is correct, but at least raising awareness not only at the local level, not only at the level of the national minorities councils within the national minority itself, but also to the level of policy making. Because I assume that when we speak very collectively about recognition of religious rights as freedom of religion and belief as one of the elementary human rights, even in secular states, of course, this is very collective statement, which doesn't really provide these nuanced elements or layers that would tackle upon religious minorities that are usually not visible. They're numerically very small, very often without any kind of political awareness or political activism in their own communities. Very often they are feeling marginalized and put aside without even considering to engage in any kind of political debates or ask for any more rights to be given to them, put aside a bit. However, it doesn't mean that states and that legal framework should not consider that and put in any kind of anti-discrimination laws, precisely because their existence is present and shouldn't be ignored. And now with the rise of evangelicalism, for example, if you see the Latin American context, Brazil is very highly populated with Pentecostal churches. You see that the dynamic of this change of especially missionary efforts of many evangelical groups is coming here as well. If you also see that Roma community here has a number of Protestant believers in the south of Serbia, you see that this kind of dynamic is changing on a daily basis, literally. And if we do not capture that kind of, I would say, dynamic that exists within ethnic national minority context, I believe that the rise of discrimination will start from their own community members, from their own minority framework, and then towards, other, because as I said, diversity is perceived differently in different contexts. Sometimes it is on declarative level in Vojvodina, something that is desirable, something that is very much practiced, something that is legally supported, but in practice, it's not always usually the case. So I think the raising awareness is one step towards that, just working, doing research on that in that area, trying really to understand the complexities, because we cannot speak about nationalism, especially in the Balkan context, without considering religious aspect. And I always feel that religion is a big elephant in the room that is somehow not easy to address, and especially if we speak about identities that are not traditional ones. Sometimes it's very difficult to even understand and to have knowledge about. So it is a mixture of quite interdisciplinary, I would say, efforts, not only of scholars, but also of practitioners and policymakers to have that kind of better understanding. I hope I did answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Before Sinisha, Dejan, we respond. Okay, we will give the opportunity to Brankica to address to us because she must to leave.
There is no question that I have to apologize, unfortunately, because I have to leave, unfortunately, earlier before we finish this panel. But before I, thanks to all panelists, you all give me much more light on my, and it will help me in my daily work, and especially from perspective of academia. And thank you very much for your much better analytical framework, which shed much more light on this topic about multiculturalism, etc. And I would like to add something with what Alexandra Đurić-Milovanović just said, and it is a part of answer of Ms. Daniela Čalaba-Vuković. I fully agree with Alexandra because we have to be aware of very simple fact that national minorities are not some homogeneous groups, and we should be aware that we have group within groups if we want to protect them in an efficient way. But it's possible to offer them efficient legal protection against discrimination if we use concept of intersectional discrimination, and we really try to use that kind of concept in our daily work, but until now we've never had a case of intersectional discrimination, but talking about ethnicity and religious minorities. But of course, it is possible. And once again, unfortunately, to be Commissioner for Equality requires to try to cover and support to all society, especially marginalized groups, and covered many different topics. And unfortunately, so because of that, I have to leave this conference to continue to speak about a very important topic, next event, sexual and reproductive rights of women and girls. So very sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much once again.
Thanks to you, and happy to see you again. Finish, please face with Daniela's questions.
Yeah, thanks very much. These are all very good questions, and I'll try to be brief. I think the first point about nationalism and globalization, yes, very much. I mean, they are interdependent. You know, traditionally there was that perception globalization takes over, nationalism disappears, but that hasn't been the case. Essentially, globalization has very much enhanced, rise of nationalisms, and this is not unusual. We had previous waves of globalization at the end of 19th century, where nationalism is still kind of in the early forms of nationalism, interdependent with imperialism. So you often have Irish nationalism in the US, in Canada, in Australia, fighting British. You have German nationalist and imperialist projects in Brazil and everywhere. So in a sense, the globalization nationalism dynamics, has been around for a fairly long time, and that continues in a sense. The second question about civic and ethnic nationalism, yeah, that's obviously a huge topic in nationalism studies. It's